Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 250 people around this question, not to prescribe you with a universal answer, but to help you explore this question for yourself. I'm hoping the guest musings, explorations, curiosities, and experiences will prompt your own inquiry into what this question means for you. While I'm also trying to share with you what I perceive to be more genuine expressions of the human experience and indeed more meaningful conversations. Which brings us to this week and the 96th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest, John Oliver. John is an artist and sense-making facilitator, exploring multidisciplinary practices based on complexity principles and narrative frameworks. Since 2020, he has developed an artistic practice that integrates the arts with complexity principles, working in portraiture film and experimental installations. Certified in developmental psychology coaching and co-founder of Human-Equity Ltd, he specialised in qualitative metrics for organisational development and human insights in investment portfolio management. Previously, John managed technology transfer projects in Nepal and Ghana for the NGO Intermediate Technology Development Group. He also spent 15 years in strategy consulting and was an early team member of the French startup OneAccess. In this expansive conversation, John shares his journey towards greater creativity and his explorations of the self and no self. We discuss sense-making through dialectics, revelations through creativity, and the concept of positive disintegration. We also delve into the dissonance experience during our transitions, with John sharing his insights on the arts as a spiritual practice. If you are currently navigating or contemplating major or minor life transitions, this conversation offers many valuable insights and themes that are worthy of your contemplation. Look, I enjoyed this conversation immensely with John. We covered a lot of themes that I think map out a lot of the stages that many of us go through on our path of self-inquiry. So I think you're going to take a lot from this conversation. And if you enjoy this episode, please like, share, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And please continue to leave your lovely reviews if you're on the podcasting platforms. Please check out the show notes below for more ways of following John's work, as well as the podcast newsletter where you can read about the reflections that these conversations you're listening to have evoked in me. You'll also find links to join my weekly free silent conversations and to connect further with me either for one-on-one coaching or indeed programs to build greater trust, connection, and communication amongst your leadership teams. So that's all I have to say for this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. And so without further ado, the 96th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. John, thank you very much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since being made aware of your work and really enjoying some of the subtlety and the insights that you're sharing, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Well, thank you, Mark.
So, John, as you're aware, the first question that I ask is the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer or explore as you move through life?
Yes. What comes up is the almost eternal polarity of self and no self.
Right.
And with my art journey, so 2020, I really committed to, okay, I need for my own developmental path and for my own sanity to just the intuition was I need to commit to a very practical and sort of immediate experience of the creative practice in lots of different forms. And it's been from the beginning and still remains this quest of in order to find oneself, or in order to connect to soul. I guess that was one of my mantras, is how do I connect to my soul? I was really evoking this question, which remains alive, is the movement between no self and self. So obviously a huge subject in so many of the contemplative traditions. But one of the, I guess, flavors of no self is through, rather than sort of stepping into pure silence or pure witnessing, to actually be in quite a, I guess, dynamic relationship with the materials, with the colors, with the objects around me and have those speak to me. So losing myself in this interaction with even quite very varied formats of creativity has been the eternal the question that continues as a daily waking up mantra of total contradiction, because it's almost like knowing how not to know, or if you see what I mean, those performative contradictions that you get into. A self that is seeking for a no self is an intention coming from a self. So there's sort of a holographic fractal nature to all of this that still seem to be swimming in. But the sort of the centrifugal force that I'm feeling into is no self. Yes, how to genuinely engage with no self, and the movement between. Yes, I mean, this is maybe another thread, but self and no self are coordinates. But even from my professional background, in complexity and the social sciences and complexity, it's actually more relevant to look at the movements between coordinates. So I then suddenly find myself, I'm back in my old analytical mind.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I hope just to throw that out there, yes, the quest of no self and the contradictions included there.
How do you, from your perspective, how do you interpret that? Because you've articulated something that speaks to me a lot at this stage in my path or existence, where I would be disingenuous to say that I do not feel very separate at times, and I'd be disingenuous to say that I've often I would feel a dissolving of those boundaries, or even through writing or something, it might be even losing myself and looking up and the clock has moved on by 2 hours and it feels like that I haven't been there almost. How do you and I love this, creating almost as two like poles as such, like the moving in and out, because I think that to me feels inevitable too. How would you characterize this experience?
Yes, well, it relates to, in many ways, yes, this quite significant philosophical domain of dialectics, how we can only make sense through a dialectic. And so energy comes from some polarity. There has to be some polarity to create a field of energy. And again, I'm just trying to choose the right words, because the recollection of so many incredible sources of writing and knowledge and wisdom on these topics, it's a constant challenge where, as individuals, we are sort of obviously synthesizing the cognitive aspects of the the map. How do we navigate these terms and these concepts? And then I'm seeking almost to answer your question with the dialectic between how we think we cognitively have, even in terms of symbols or language, some scaffolding as to our human condition of making sense of the outside world. But then what is the dialectic with cognition? And I'm exploring a few possibilities of what might be the polarity, and it could be emotions, it could be intuition, the subtle energy, and the movement between, I guess, yes, the indescribable, the non-verbal, the energetic sense of the whole is actually what I was going to say. One of my other major missions 4 or 5 years ago, when shifting into a deeper creative practice, was to, how do I practice sensing into the whole beyond any analysis, between any conceptual, sort of conceptual lexicon, um, or even symbols. So sensing of the whole. This is a big theory in even aesthetics. So yes, another opposite of cognition would be aesthetics. And this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but there's quite a few directions to go in here, but I'm on a mission to, yes, so cognition is looking at the parts in many ways, whereas aesthetics and the sense of the whole is an opposite, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And there might be a connection between, when we're in a cognitive dimension, there's a sense of the self is more alive and more applied, and sense of the whole, and the sense of aesthetic, which is non-verbal and non-conceptual. And of course, we go into all of the Eastern contemplative traditions, then that's a very generative polarity, and could be connected back to this idea of self and no self. So yes, it's just incredible how I mentioned before the sort of the holographic and fractal nature of what we are all navigating, thanks to your incredible work with this podcast, for example, is there are so many common references using different maybe terms, but they land on some fundamentals which seem to be really in common across vast domains.
There's two things that you've touched on there that I'd almost like to elaborate on. One being the sense of communication between materials and yourself, before, almost as part of the creative act. You mentioned that kind of as a prelude to moments where your sense of self may dissolve, and then maybe afterwards silence as well, because just as you were saying that, and even reflecting on my own kind of sense of separateness and connection, silence I've often found, is some sort of a gateway to just realizing or a revealing of what maybe is that our sense of perception isn't noting at this point in time. But just I guess to start off with that feeling or that experience of even that the materials you may be in commune with, even if it is in a pre kind of verbal state. Could you elaborate on that experience?
Yes. So it's funny because even just it's wonderful to hear you share just even the lead up to the prompt, because in many ways, there is a fascinating application of what I've just been mentioning with regards to silence, that in some ways we can only really explore silence in all its richness through its opposite, which would be noise, or which would be being filled, and in my art practice, what has been absolutely almost, there are scientific principles with the creative practice. If you do this and if you do that, then there's almost a guarantee that you will have this kind of an experience. One example is when, yes, I guess this relationship with the physical, even just mixing concrete, and just you're in the action and you're aware of the consistency and the evolution of how the material is reacting to all of the inputs you're giving it. And there's sort of a, for me, quite intoxicating relationship in my art practice with all of the textures that I'm dealing with. And so there's a lot of noise. You could call it, a lot of noise, a lot of things going on. The senses are being really kind of invaded in many ways.
Right.
And then what is absolutely fabulous is just letting it go and walking away from it. and something happening in the background over maybe a day or a week. And it's like, wow, something has communicated itself to me through that oscillation between full engagement and then letting go. And I was working on a particular project, which was, I was always working with recycled materials, and I love working with wood, at a whole stack of recycled wood. And my art studio is the garden shed. And outside, I had this pile of wood, and I was gradually putting it sort of together in quite a random way. And I thought, oh, maybe it needs to be a flag. It needs to be this big wooden flag. And so I did have a kind of direction which was completely intuitive, and I made this almost like, I guess, like 10-foot high wooden flag. And then I was taking just a day break on it, and it spoke to me, and it said it needed to be a white flag, and then it needed to have red drops on it. And so I'm just following this voice and have no idea where it's going. And my two daughters, who were like 10 and 12 at the time, come down to the garden shed and say, "Daddy, what are you doing?" And I say, "Oh, well, actually, you should know by now, I'm the last person you should be asking what I'm doing." And, according to so much of the literature that I have on creative experiences, that I was at least in some ways reassured that I'm not going insane, that these are quite reliable milestones in your practice where, you don't know what you're doing, but you can tune in to some intuitive draw. And then, to the extent that I still didn't really know what this meant, I did begin to realize that basically, yes, this notion of, with the flag, this notion in society about identity and frontiers and boundaries, and there's something I wanted to play with that. And then, for some reason, I took this big flag to the beach. We live near the ocean here in southwest of France, and I took it to the beach in my van, and then from the car park of the beach, walking down to the water's edge, I thought, people are going to be really thinking I am completely nuts. What am I doing with this flag? And then I lay down in the water with this flag on top of me, and I asked the local fisherman to take a photograph of me. And it's sort of so visceral, that fighting of the sensible mind and the artistic, creative mind, allowing yourself that permission just to do something crazy. And so I think a lot of dissonance, a lot of cognitive dissonance with this process. What is it I'm doing here? And then I picked up the flag and walked back to the van and said, oh my God, I know exactly what this is all about. And it turned out to be a dedication to my grandfather, who I never knew. He passed away in the Second World War, and his boat sunk in the Mediterranean. And so I did a video piece with sort of semi-improvised poetry, and then switching to photographs of me on the beach with this flag as a dedication to my grandfather. And it was like, wow, yeah, that's true. The creative process, the going through the cognitive dissonance, and then the revelation of, now I know what that means. So yeah, that was one. And they continue, those kind of revelations downstream.
What, just out of interest, what was that, like, what was the experience like of that realization or revelation? Like, was it, as you're saying it, I'm almost feeling it, like I'm almost imagining a kind of a sense of like overwhelm but deep satisfaction or something like this. Like, how would you have described it?
Yes, totally. Yeah, the whole body, wow, just vibrating with, now I know what. Yes. So exactly, yes, very low centered intuition rising up. And I guess this is where, even though right from the beginning, with your kind question about, what is the main thread that I'm looking at right now in my life, and it comes back to this, yes, self and no self, but you can never escape the self, because that movement to interpreting what that flag meant is, yes, my analytical mind, so I'll never escape it. And but the energy, the energy between that polarity was very, very significant, and exactly what I was hoping to search for. In 2020, I had my own consulting brand, a small consulting brand in organisational development, and working in some fascinating areas of culture and working in narratives, sense making. But I was still finding myself in a very analytical, heady space, working with software platforms and Zoom conferences and contract negotiations, and so integrating the artistic experience into my life in many ways. I was very reassured that this is what I was looking for, to kind of escape from, get enough exit velocity from my previous life.
Right.
And one of the themes that also really carried me through is this idea of positive disintegration. I don't know whether you've heard of that.
No, please elaborate. It sounds gorgeous.
Well, it's a Polish psychologist called Kazimierz Dabrowski, who wrote about, from his point of view, in our personal journeys, there's a necessary disintegration before we are able to move through thresholds of our development. And part of my background as well is developmental psychology, which is how adults, well, obviously grounded in how from the earliest of ages, as infants, we make sense and we interact with the world, and our identity shifts from being an individual to then being associated to a family, to then, as we're through adolescence, we regain our own sense of individuality to then make sense of ourselves as part of a collective, in how we then go out into the world in our professional identity, and these oscillations, so developmental journeys that go on throughout the whole of our life. And yes, one of the terms which has given me a lot of, in many ways, guidance is Dabrowski talks about how the transitions between, there are many polarities, again, in these developmental journeys, and there's many different schools of developmental psychology. But in many ways, this, again, theory U, which I'm sure you know about, so there's so many references to these movements of the dismantling in order to reassemble. And one of my first artworks was actually a self-portrait, but a very kind of rough self-portrait, painted on lats of recycled wood, so probably about 20 different lats of wood, and I did a almost sort of caricature self-portrait. And then I shifted the lats, so I'm kind of out of sequence. And then I had a gun to my temple, but the gun
Right.
was painted afterwards, so the gun is completely in the right shape, but the rest of the painting is out of position. So the gun is in focus, and I'm not in focus, and so forth. And so I was literally, that was probably my second artwork, actually, rather than so I'm pretty sure now it's the second artwork. So I was literally inviting this personal disintegration. And it has been a support to know that there are schools of thought. And Dabrowski, I think he was most active in the 60s and 70s, and was in the United States. He moved from Poland, but there's an extraordinary amount of fascinating material. And I guess we are moving as a collective. Our maps are, there is a journey that we are on, with how, as collectively, we are bringing together, and even AI is part of that we are able to recognize the relevance of so many maps and so many frameworks. Here we go, back to the cognitive.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
just Out of interest again, though, like if that's only that was only your second piece.
Mm.
Was that because I'm really fascinated, kind of in the process or the felt experience of some of these moments, and was was there an intention? You know, you talked about even the flag. Something emerged in the moment. You weren't quite clear about it. At this point, when you were stepping more into this, or you know, as you had this lovely expression, like kind of generating enough exit velocity to step into almost a new life. Um, did this emerge before you as well? And was this or was there some intention? Like, were you feeling quite like forceful about this, or how would you even describe it?
Yes, I think it has been a combination of my previous analytical self wanting to, in many ways, yes, walk the talk that I would share with people, over many, many years. And I've done the artist's way. I don't know whether you are familiar with Julia Cameron's
Yeah, I
artist's way.
did.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I'm very fortunate to have a sister of mine who's been facilitating workshops with the artist's way for many years and managed to join her on one. And that was pretty much a life-changing moment. Um, but I hope I'm asking your question to say that, yes, in some ways it is a contradiction because I was intentionally setting a path which was building up over many years in order to practice not having an intention.
yeah, yeah,
And then there's quite an artistic background which goes back a couple of generations now, but there was something very intergenerational. So I'm fascinated about intergenerational work and even constellations that can work with intergenerational work, and even the power of first names. So a great great grandfather of mine was part of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood,
right.
and yes, it's the only heirloom that I inherited after my parents passed away was a bronze bust of my great great grandfather, who was an artist dealing with the very contemporary themes of the good, the true, and the beautiful. The rise of Darwin's work in his lifetime, and my great great grandfather being earlier on in his life practicing um, Christian, but then losing his faith. And if you Google art, science, and religion, normally there's an article from the Tate Britain that references my great great grandfather, which comes up first on the search engines. So for over 20 years now, I've also been very influenced by Ken Wilber. I don't know whether you know Ken
Yeah,
Wilber.
I do
Yeah.
indeed.
So
Yeah,
so the good, the true, and the beautiful. Um, the fundamentals, yeah, transcendentals, which have obviously been brought into very um, direct contemporary context thanks to people like Ken Wilber. And then I'm Googling um, the this term and coming across that connection through to my great great grandfather. In some ways, it's been a long term intention in many ways to connect spirituality, connect consciousness, connect the arts, connect the sciences into my adult life. So I hope I answered your question, Mark. Sorry, another very long-winded path, but it has been in some ways this is sort of the contradiction that I'm wanting to explore no self, but the whole journey is being directed by very much a intentional self.
yeah. But you know, for me, I find I don't know if this resonates with you, but I sense if life were to come through me, if I want to see myself as a vessel or an instrument in that, that there is a note that when life comes through me, there's either a note or a frequency or a vibration that when it aligns even with the construct or even the lived experience of what or who I am,
Mm,
um, that there feels like there's a way in which I don't know, that can come through me that feels unobstructed. So it's almost like my not my responsibility or something like this, but my part in it is perhaps to create the to clear the vessel for life to come through me. And that to me feels like it feels maybe even just by virtue of um, subtraction. It's not like I'm saying to get to a higher state of consciousness. It may be even letting go. That's why I find the aspect of silence very interesting within this. But there is some part to play, even if it is simply letting go. And I don't know. I think there's moments in this life where I can feel deeply connected and aware of my fractal's nature, its alignment with a bigger life or a bigger experience, if you get me.
Yeah, totally. Yes, totally. Well, also, you've helped me prompt actually where I've been wanting to get to, which is with these polarities and the contradiction. In some ways, in order to reach a deeper no self, you have to have a deeper sense of self. And so, yeah, Ken Wilber refers to that as span. And then there's Mark Gaffney. I don't know whether you know Mark Gaffney.
No.
He's written a book about your unique self. So, I have been exploring for a good few years. I have a brother who's 10 years older than me, and for the last 30 years, he's been an ordained Buddhist order member in a Buddhist community in Cambridge. And yes, I try to emulate his path and really dive into the retreats and the meditation. But over the years, what I'm curious about is, in some ways, what are the counter narratives for a kind of a generative perspective, because I would offer. I mean, this is where I think I am at, is trying to even and walk my talk here in what I'd like to offer, which is this fully living the contradiction of, in order to seek a no self, you have to actually deepen your unique self.
Right.
And in order to connect more deeply to the collective, you need to deepen your sense of uniqueness. And I have a very good friend who said to me, John, you need to be really egotistical to be an artist. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting, because the first 3 or 4 years, it was only my walking down to the garden shed and having to battle with my sense of self to just sort of let go and give myself permission to do, whatever arose on the canvas. And it seems to me that it does make sense that, yes, you do have to be incredibly egotistical to be an artist, or have artistry, going much wider, rather than just sort of defining arts as an aesthetic creation, but artistry going far wider. That, yes, you are creating that stretch, that span, increasing the energy between self and no self.
Can you elaborate for me? Because it sounds familiar to me. So I don't just want to project upon it. You touched on it even just there, like walking down to the garden shed, but even earlier with, even the feeling of walking down to the beach with the flag. And then even though there was this dissonance, still inviting a fisherman to take a photo. So there's this lovely kind of, still a dissonance, like not an absolute flow of permission. Yet that dissonance or that discomfort doesn't impede you or inhibit you from still following through on something. Could you describe that experience a little bit? Because I think it's one that's kind of overlooked a lot of times. People almost just talk about entering into a flow state or dissolving themselves, but I think this part of it is this pulses, or it comes and goes at different times.
Yes. Well, I mean, initially, the impulse is one of desperation, one of, I have to do something different, midlife crisis or mental health struggles. And so this is where the positive disintegration territory comes in, because people often find themselves out of control in their lives, and the, let's say, absolute kind of extreme self-destruction situations occur. And I mean, describing it, for me, there was definitely, I mean, yeah, a lifelong quest to, yes, lean into the darkness, leaning into the shadow, our shadow self. So, in some ways, there's not much control there, and so that has been part of my journey. Has Yeah, my shadow self, and just in deep struggle, dark places, in the dark night of the soul, and so forth, to then, I guess, I've been fortunate to have some exposure to what the arts can offer. So I had some inkling of how to go through the darkness. And yes, I must admit, I've read a book which has been deeply influential on care of the soul by Thomas More, and he talks about holding the darkness in, welcoming that in. And so, again, yet another polarity, the light. In order to find light, we need to hold the darkness. And on the other side, I've been thinking to myself, well, maybe the arts can be a way of in some ways, a sort of a mini breakdowns, sort of micro
Yeah.
breakdowns of the self. So it's less life shattering, and so that can be curated. And that's been one of my, I guess, hopes, is that in my evangelization of how important the arts are in society, is that it's a almost sort of a far more granular and accessible way of breaking the self down as a spiritual practice for more sort of micro personal shifts, rather than having to wait for the health crisis where the body just is telling you through a chronic illness you need to change your life direction. So if you sort of mean, it has been part of
Yeah.
my journey, those outside forced impulses that you need to change your direction, to now how can we prompt ourselves in with a little bit more, not just, well, I was saying control, just a little bit more awareness of where the territory is leading us through the creative practice. And I've even done this actually at a conference, funny enough, which is to map people's narratives on to what extent have the biggest pivot moments in your life been imposed from outside forces or have been self-directed. And then on the other axis, what was the long-term impact of that shift in your life? So again, I hope I was somewhat responding to your question there, Mark.
Oh, there's you absolutely did, but there's no the question isn't a restriction on where it goes. The Just really fascinated, because this is a big question I've had quite frequently. What was the response to that? Almost like a internally driven or externally imposed.
Mm.
How did most people interact with that?
Yeah, so we had about 20 people in the room to map this, and there were, yes, now I'm just trying to, it's 2 years ago now, because in some ways one of the thesis that my co-facilitator and I had was that there is an irony that, yes, it's the outside events that are really beyond us that create the biggest shifts in our life, and that did definitely show up. Anecdotes, obviously, small population of people who are participating in this. In that particular instance, we had some nice anecdotes which did show that it was the external imposed changes which really provoked the deepest impacts. And yes, I mean, you actually come across quite a few interesting biographies of people who in childhood have a very severe illness and has set them on to a path of inquiry throughout the whole of their adult life, that they look back and say, if I didn't have that illness and I was in bed for a year when I was 12 years old, I don't think I would have been at all on the path that I'm on now. But the exercise, yes, we had, I'm recalling that there was quite a spread, and we were seeking to sort of prove or disprove our hypothesis of it sort of by design or by disaster is another way of phrasing that.
Right.
And it was an interesting exercise with some contrasts, no particular cluster of people, so they were quite spread out, and it was interesting. So in this process, actually, what is great is that you see some of the trends, you see some of the outliers, and then you get the people to share their unique narrative. And then it leads to a lot of discussion and sharing about the unique context of what was in that story. All this to say, yes, there does remain, I think, if I may just sort of completely paraphrase and sort of jump ahead, which is, even though I'm evangelizing the artistic experience as mini micro breakdowns, which can be consciously steered or can be consciously engaged with, it doesn't take away from the fact that actually the meteorite that lands into your life is going to potentially generate the deepest reset.
But this is but it's very interesting, because I go through a lot of similar kind of thought patterns myself, in terms of, like, can we, not to insulate ourselves from some of these life-shattering moments necessarily, and definitely, just like you alluded to, going to your sister's workshop around the artist's way, I assume journaling became or free writing became part of a process.
Yeah.
And then like I really wonder, like, are these the tools that would stall, or maybe is it not that they would not that they would stop a future event occurring, but maybe they end up being like the tools that help us put or to handle these shattering moments frequently. I recall just a former guest. Well, I actually also interviewed Thomas More as well after I read that book, Care of the Soul.
All right. Cool.
But I'd also interviewed this gentleman called Parker Palmer, and his life seemed very interesting in that I'd struggle to say that he wasn't living a creative life or an engaged life from a perspective of soul. And he talked about depression in his 60s as well as his 40s. And so I don't know. I'm wondering, even in my own life, just now that you're referencing this, like, can we even stop the earth-shattering moments, or is that even the point, or is it just that we have some feeling of a context, a compass, maybe a sense of connection with ourselves, like that maybe it will just help us not regather things. I'm not trying to make it sound like a race to be back to your normal self, because that could lose a lot of the richness in the process too. But yeah, I'm wondering, because one of the reasons even why I wanted to talk to you is just this very, I think this creative part is still actually quite underappreciated in terms of our mental health, dissolving of the self, finding of the self, all of these things that you're touching on. And yet I would still see some highly creative people that still have their experiences of despair or big moments in their life of what how they thought or perceived life to be falling down as.
Mm. Yes. Yes, it is such a fine line for all of my eulogizing of disintegration and no self. The line is so fine between that tipping too far and losing all sense of self. And I think apparently one of the major issues with depression is it's the right hand side of the brain, the emotional brain that runs away. All of the side of the brain which we're referring to with the creative experience, without some cognitive scaffolding and structure, we
Right.
can no longer function. And even there's some fascinating things. I'm actually in discussion with a political party with regards to capturing narratives and a more generative political discourse, and how emotions and cognitive constructs show up in how people make sense of their political orientation. And emotions, yes, there's a obviously a necessity for both of these processes, the intuitive, the right hand side, obviously, and the left hand side, to interact. And obviously, I mean, there's such a vast wealth with McGilchrist, who are talking about balancing. And yes, I'm sorry, I'm losing track of your question. And there was something I was wanting to lead up to. Could you remind me of your question, Mark?
Yeah, it was the balance, I guess, between the safe using
Yes.
creativity to safeguard ourselves against a shattering moment versus, the not even versus, but aligned with the importance of how these moments shape us, and also wondering are some of these disintegrations of self still inevitable, and yet when we're equipped with these tools, or we have them in our arsenal as such, that we can find, or they're still hugely important, even just to navigate our way through that disintegrating as such.
Yes, I am pretty convinced by there is a necessary disintegration. And I guess what I was, sort of circling around was this idea of just the fine line between how do we judge what is the optimum degree of disintegration. I guess that's
Yeah, yeah,
what, I
yeah.
guess sort of what I'm still reflecting about, and where I was wanting to get to in my previous sentences. And in some ways there is that sort of moral dilemma that you wouldn't choose to, in many ways, you wouldn't choose to have an illness that forces you to stay in bed for a year in the intention that you're hoping it's going to change your life forever on some incredibly generative path.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
some fascinating dilemma there, which does come back to, I guess, this is very much at the heart of my personal mission in these last 5 years, which is to help increase the granularity of mapping the creative journey so that we can share better instruments of guiding us what are the let's say optimum degrees of disintegration, and creating the balancing, yes, recovery processes. So the cognitive, here me going back to my old life as being sort of an ultra analytical person, that so many of us has been in. Really appreciate hearing about your journey as well. That in some ways I do find myself a bit in a kind of a schizophrenic existence, because I'm going deep into the artistic practice, but then an essential part of my mission is to add to the cognitive mapping of what that's all about. So I'm back into my previous life, previous identity,
Yeah.
and then obviously the reconciliation, that these different sides of yourself, bringing them together in order to build something that is a synthesis and even a complete, yes, something novel, because you're putting these two opposite forces together. Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think there's, even in the way you describe that, though, even in our own internal selves, in terms of how we just interpret the world, like I still think I think there's something kind of gorgeous about this, as you're kind of saying, almost schizophrenic existence. Like it's as you've touched on so often, it's almost in the opposite poles that there's enough energy or enough friction that is required for something to emerge from it. And even, I don't know, even the way that we're there's something about this, even the creative act of losing oneself could be like, the no self expression. But then when we come back into this version of ourselves, or this experience of ourselves, where we are trying to make sense of the world and maybe even aid other people in making sense of the world, there's like a nice kind of circular, or there's a nice feedback loop from almost reporting on the losing of oneself,
There we go. Exactly. Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yes. One other little anecdote, actually, just thinking how fantastic it is. You've interviewed so many great references in the creative space and in the space of spiritual journeys. With Nick Askew, the immediate connection was, wow, I can go to the opposite of who I am right now, which is in the organizational developmental consulting domain, and winning new mandates. It's a highly competitive domain. There's a huge amount which is being written on these subjects, and so it's a busy space. And that sort of, you need to have a sense of who you are and getting that exposure in order to make some way in that domain. And with Nick Askew, it was like, okay, so I can sit behind a camera, do nothing, just be there, and I can be enough. And it was like, whoa, and that was another moment which was, okay, this is a very deliberate exercise, and there seems to be lots of key elements of the terrain which have been referenced by people like Nick. And then give myself a minimum amount of confidence to say, okay, John, just trust the process. Invite people in front of your camera and just not do anything or say anything. And so that has been absolutely, fabulous experience. And the stepping away was, yes, okay, this is exactly what I've been wanting to do, which is to go to the opposite of who I was in 2019, 2020, when I started to close down my consulting work. And say, okay, yes, this is kind of it's delivering everything it said on the packaging.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
But this is, I find this, I find the words, or sorry, the experience of silence, and then the use of the word enough comes up a lot for me. It comes up a lot even with silence sessions or conversations that I host.
yes, I
And
saw that. Yeah,
I find that really interesting, that it's almost in a non-verbal setting. And even just the sheer importance, because we tend to almost devalue that by saying all I'm doing is just being here. Do you know what I mean? I often say this, like, all I'm doing is just being silent, or whatever it may be. But it almost, the sheer our sheer presence or attention, I think, is, it's almost like we have an inverse idea of that in our culture, that yes, quite frankly, it is absolutely enough just for you to be there, just for you to be holding somebody, not even holding them in attention, but directing your attention towards something, somebody, and just the sheer value and weight of that. And to me, it speaks a lot to how our words and our labels can be very divisive. And we're still going to continue to converse, right? Like we're still going to do this. But I think it's more that kind of polarity again, as long as you can have enough experiences to know that the inherent value of that silence or that experience, then it's okay to go back to chatting away and to conversing away.
Mm.
But it's almost that experience of both that allows us to maybe peel back some of the importance from the words that we're sharing or the significance.
Mm.
Or I don't know about you. I'd love to hear about your initial experiences of standing or sitting behind a camera and not saying anything, because it also shows us that it's okay for the words not to emerge and it's still going to be fine. And I think even in that, it gives a lot of depth to the present moment experience, but also to the sense of connection that may exist between us, irrespective of whether we're talking or not.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and this has been in many ways a way that I introduced the filming work, which is we are going to be together in a paradox where if we have an intention as to what we're hoping is going to be captured, then we're closing down the space. I know that Nick doesn't like to refer to holding a space, um, but I invite people as part of my initial brief quite explicitly to say there is a wonderful irony that by having no intention, and that if we sit together in silence for an hour, it's still a win. As long as you're ready to go with that, then you never know, something may show up. And I've never been let down. I've done about maybe 50 portraits, and so that runs through every time. And this is where I do enjoy kind of, and it has given me a great deal of support. Talking about sort of cognitive, in many ways, handrails, which is I can put my artist job description, I can put my artist hat on, and say your job description is to deal with ambiguity, contradiction, um, not knowing, and uh, 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 taking things apart. And so all of those domains that we normally run away from are part of the job description of the artist, as far as I can interpret, or as far as I kind of am labeling an artist. So in the portrait experience, I like to call it like an artistic experiment each time. And and then there is also, yes, I'm coming back to, it's funny because in some ways the traditions of contemplative Eastern wisdom that I was trying to follow in my 20s, where I hit a bit of a wall to say the sheer kind of, I guess, the core practice of silent meditation was obviously incredibly generative, but it seemed to, yeah, I'm trying to put the words through it. I couldn't follow my brother down the same path, and I guess, yes, one of the major themes that kind of repeats what I mentioned earlier, which is how may the arts be considered just as much a spiritual practice as going to a monastery on a week's silent meditation retreat. So in a Buddhist retreat, what are the examples of where you're working with the unique self and that self-expression, the radical self-expression? It's one of the inquiry. I mean, maybe a Buddhist would be able to answer that question in a very erudite way. And I'm not far from Plum Village, where Thich Nhat Hanh, of course, is based, and so I get to connect with quite a few people around in that community. And just one other little footnote with regard to the filming. There is this many ways of balance between these opposites, where I'm nobody behind the camera, or just in obviously unconditional witnessing. But then what I find in the editing, it's like I am really applying my kind of artistic, intuitive self as to choosing which moment to keep in the edit and how to put the edit together. And then I would send off the final edit to the subject, crossing my fingers. Oh, I've taken some really intuitive, personal judgment calls in the edit. I just hope they like it. And it was an absolute revelation how people came back saying, "Oh, that's great. Don't change anything." And yet it was a very personal, and people have pointed out, John, this is not a no self John showing up. This is a very kind of unique, your own source, which is being integrated into it.
Yeah, I think it sounds almost like the integration of our wholeness, right? Like, because I don't know, even if people have been listening to this for a while, this podcast, sometimes I may not diminish the importance of our mental mind, but almost, in that way that we can often run to the opposite pole of how we've been processing life, and maybe eulogize one of the ends of the pole more than the other for a period of time before it comes back into balance. I don't know. I think there's something about this human experience, which is to experience both the separation and the connection, to experience both the mind and the heart. And I think however we come to it, whenever there's an expression of wholeness in that entire process, and it sounds beautiful then in the sense of, behind the camera you're just, witnessing essentially. And then while working through the edits, there's very clear judgment calls or snapshots being, or ideas being cultivated, and I think it's I don't know, I think sometimes in our paths we can get a little too caught up with like the idea of where we're going to and the intention that we may have behind it, and get maybe even too attached to the spiritual, the unconscious, whatever it may be. And whenever we invariably do that, like just as you said, like an aspect of depression can be when that scaffolding is no longer there to support. I think there's something deeply important about not rejecting elements of this human experience. Like if it's a very clear felt experience, then it's a worthwhile integration into the whole, because it's not going to be by denying or repressing a trait that I think we experience that sense of enoughness or
A Ken Wilber interview with quite a charismatic, his name hopefully will come back to me, quite a charismatic priest based in California, who talks about in his diocese or in his church community, they talk about the ministration in the administration. So even if in the community they're putting fundraising letters into envelopes and so forth, the mindfulness and the spiritual practice in the smallest of acts can be invited
right.
of that. And I have a question actually, Mark. I'd love to know what your angle on this would be if we kind of continue to explore this idea of polarities and energy between what would be the dialectic compared to the soul.
Can you just elaborate on that so I make sure I understand it?
I've been getting maybe a bit carried away with, I guess, the fundamental question of self and no self, and the inviting, I guess, the sort of third dimension that, thanks to a deeper sense of unique self, we can access a deeper sense of the collective, and that there's a movement between the conscious processing, the cognitive scaffolding, compared to the more intuitive, non-symbolic, non-verbal, energetic dimensions that we can relate to. If we hold this notion of a soul, might the notion of how we connect to our soul, whether individual or collective, might that notion be in relationship with an opposing polarity?
That's a lovely question. The first things that are coming to mind for me are around kind of like soul and spirit. So soul kind of being very much in my body in the ground of life, and spirit maybe kind of an idea of ascension, maybe even a guiding star of my, like a higher expression of consciousness or divinity. And there's something about soul which seems to be not only just mine, but even maybe part of a collective grounding. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I started to get into meditation retreats or stepping away from former work, you mentioned obviously consulting practice. For me, it would be finance. There was reading books like Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth and things like this, and absorbing this into what was merely intellectual information at the time, but setting myself very almost clear goals, as much as I can smile at that now, but around developing higher levels of consciousness, that be a purification of myself. And I think I almost, in that, it felt quite a hollow reaching for something, like a disembodied reaching, rather than maybe feeling through it, like having my feet firmly on the ground, and trusting almost like the wisdom of my human body. Like, so if the soul communicates to me, I think it's almost in energies. And I think sometimes people, as far as I perceive it, we mix up the sense of, if the soul, like if our intuition or whatever we want, and I'm not saying intuition and soul are synonymous, or the interchangeable, but the way we sometimes talk about the wisdom of ourselves or our older selves or the body, it's not like it's going to bring you a string of perfect outcomes. It's like the reward, I think, of that is literally just responding to what your body is saying to you is your note, like what your role in this whole orchestra is to play. Like if you express that, that will be the reward itself. I think our minds, even people that are on a spiritual path, look for material signs or even signs of wealth to endorse the fact that they made the right decision spiritually. I think it's more, if I can express from that place, or if I can use the guidance of my soul, that the chips may fall where they may, yet I still will feel a connectedness and a sense of belonging and enoughness in my life, irrespective of how other people are responding to me, or what a market might tell me about what I'm creating, or something else.
Yeah, wow, that really landed. Yes, thank you. That was fabulous. And I feel we don't hear enough, or at least in my connection to media, or the books that I'm reading, and more, I guess, the contemporary conversations that I'm tuning into, I feel we don't hear enough about the dynamic between spirit and soul. And that does speak to my own inquiry, that spirit has its own shadow path, as you were saying, sort of the departure, the abstraction, the ascent. And that's where Thomas More's book was very influential, about that acceptance and the necessary embrace of soul as, in fact, the dark side.
Yeah.
And I've just read a book about tantric, urban tantra, which is absolutely fascinating. And there's one very provocative invitation in this book, which says, you could argue that there is as much spirit, well, I guess it's spiritual, yes. What would be the name then, as we integrate spirit and soul? But how about we open our minds to sense, well, I mean, even just our sexuality as a spiritual practice. How can, with the pathology of masculine sexual expression and so forth, how might we embrace sexuality as a spiritual practice? And you might be able to find in this book, it's saying, you might find this might be sort of on the soul work, but in a BDSM dungeon, a spirit, kind of like a, I don't know, trying to find the word for it, but I mean, it was generally saying, that how about just a thought experiment there? You could see a BDSM dungeon as part of your spiritual journey, kind of working with the dark energy, and again, sort of inviting it. The artistry of being able to consciously lean into these spaces are absolutely fascinating. And yes, there's the dialectic between soul and spirit is, thank you for that. It really landed, and it's, I must admit, resonating for me a great deal about taking on some of these taboo subjects, which, when seen through the eyes of these are manifestation of soul, and when embraced together with spirit, create some incredible synthesis. And in many ways, I see the artistic practice leaning towards embracing the sort of messiness and all aspects of all of our energetic levels, and even, there's quite a lot of sexual energy I find when doing certain art practices. I find myself sort of really almost, there can be some rituals that help me step into a certain level of conscious connection, and just kind of really coming into my body and feeling my whole body resonate with the materials. There's something really quite powerful there, and so compared to, yes, going to a meditation retreat or going to a church, a sermon, I think we could do both.
yeah.
Really both places,
I'll because I guess, like, what's what could be more of a creative act than the act of sex and a child being produced? Like, it's, so these energies being present through or being connected with, I think that's an exploration for myself that I'm still exploring with, in terms of that connectivity between creativity and sexuality, and an expression, a healthy expression or an integrated expression of both, which is, I think, is a fascinating journey for anyone to be on. And just looking at the time, John, and thinking about where we started this, like the question around, like, the idea of self and no self, and even like, how do I connect with my soul, to talking about even positive disintegration, and creating enough exit velocity from a past self into what we're becoming, or even keeping up with what we're becoming. You mentioned things around leaning into the darkness in some parts of your journey, obviously stepping more into art and creativity as an expression of that. and combining a lot of not leaving parts of yourself behind, and still of combining spirituality, art, philosophy, the sciences as well, in trying to find an expression that almost sounds like a fuller expression of your own whole self, along with even just what you've noted there in terms of is sexual expression or sexuality, and the creative process as well. And then also the subtlety of experiences of silence, and maybe what that reveals to ourselves about ourselves, and maybe a sense of enoughness that we may already realize. And even this continual kind of pointing, not to just poles, but almost paradox, and interpreting what we're doing. This lovely kind of friction that seems to come up, that is also maybe needed to at times create this exit velocity as well, or this moving through transitions or phases. Really curious, John, to hear from you your take on the question of what is a good life for you, John.
Ooh, I try to resist sort of thinking ahead of time. Wonderful. With regards to this. And a good life for me, this is yes, is I mean, the phrase is right there, and it's I don't know why I'm hesitating. I don't understand why there's some sort of lead in, or there's something I'm wanting to frame it in, but it's around being intimate with death and knowing that I knew how to love.
Wow.
I've just completed a training course on accompanying people in palliative care, and we'll be starting very soon in actually accompanying people. And it's really triggered, yes, this, when I'm a good life, and that sounds completely ironic, but I guess this is very resonant in talking about, as we've been exploring all along, contradictions, but a good life is being close to death, being very intimate relationship with death. And I guess the only regret I could imagine myself having is that I didn't love enough. Yeah, it's quite a few other versions that I had previously.
No, this is perfect, and it'll probably just prompt a whole line of conversation between you and I after we finish recording. But I love the sense of an intimacy with death, in creating or engaging us with a fuller appreciation and intimacy with life itself. So this answer resonates very strongly with me, John. So look, I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed these lines of inquiry. And I think when I'm listening back to it, it'll spark further expansions of some of these things as well. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, thank you, Mark, and a deep bow to you in your wonderful energy in hosting this in such a beautiful way.